The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the Nebraska prairie as Clara O'Sullivan clutched her dwindling water canteen, her throat parched and her dress torn from days of walking. She had been abandoned, left for dead by the wagon train after the Sioux attack 3 days prior. Hiding in the tall grass had saved her life, but now, alone in the vastness of the Great Plains in 1876, she feared dying of thirst would be her fate. Clara's honey-colored hair hung in matted strands around her dirt-smudged face. At 22, she had seen more hardship than most, having left her family's failing farm in Pennsylvania for the promise of a teaching position in Oregon. Now that dream seemed as distant as the horizon itself. A rustling sound made her freeze. She held her breath, wondering if wolves had caught her scent. Instead, she heard the rhythmic hoofbeats of an approaching horse. "Hello there," a deep voice called out. "You all right, miss?" Clara looked up to see a tall figure on horseback silhouetted against the fiery sky. As he drew closer, she could make out his features' strong jawline, stubbled face, and piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "Water." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion and approached cautiously, leading his chestnut quarter horse by the reins. He knelt beside her, uncorking his canteen. "Small sips," he instructed, his voice gentler now as he helped her drink. "Too much at once will make you sick." Clara nodded gratefully, fighting the urge to gulp the precious liquid. "Xavier Holcomb," he said, introducing himself. "Most folks call me Zav." "Clara O'Sullivan," she replied after a moment, her voice slightly stronger. "I was with the Perkins wagon train. There was an attack. I hid in the grass. When I came out, everyone was gone." Xavier's expression darkened. "I heard about that. 3 days ago, wasn't it? You've been out here alone all this time?" Clara nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by emotion. 3 days of terror, hunger, and the certainty of death crashed down on her at once, and she began to sob. Without hesitation, Xavier placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now, Miss O'Sullivan. I'm taking you to Rivercross. It's the nearest settlement. My ranch is just outside town." "Thank you," she managed between sobs. Xavier helped her to her feet, but her legs buckled beneath her. Without comment, he swept her up and placed her atop his horse, then swung up behind her. "Lean back against me if you need to," he said, reaching around her to take the reins. "It's about an hour's ride." Clara felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back as they began to move, the gentle rocking motion of the horse almost hypnotic. For the first time in days, she felt safe. Despite her best efforts to stay alert, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into sleep, cradled in the arms of a stranger whose name she barely knew. Xavier felt the exact moment Clara's body went slack against him. He adjusted his hold to keep her secure in the saddle, studying her face in the fading light. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, he could see she was beautiful, but more than that, she was a survivor. Not many could have lasted 3 days alone after a Sioux attack. The prairie stretched out around them, the tall grasses rippling like waves in the evening breeze. His ranch was modest by some standards, 300 acres with a small herd of cattle and a few good horses, but it was his. At 30, Xavier had spent half his life working the land, first for others and now for himself. By the time they reached the outskirts of Rivercross, night had fallen completely. The town was little more than a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of houses. Xavier rode past it all, continuing another mile to his ranch. The 2-story farmhouse came into view, a lantern burning in the window. As they approached, the front door opened, and an elderly woman stepped onto the porch, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Xavier Holcomb. "I was about to send out a search party," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. Then she noticed the figure slumped against him. "Good Lord, who's that?" "Survivor from the Perkins wagon train, Mrs. Finch," he explained as he brought his horse to a stop. "Been alone on the prairie for 3 days. She needs tending." Mrs. Finch, his housekeeper of 5 years, immediately switched from scolding to efficiency. Bring her inside. I'll heat water and make up the guest room. Xavier carefully dismounted, then gathered Clara into his arms. She stirred slightly but didn't wake as he carried her into the house and up the stairs to the small but comfortable guest room. Mrs. Finch followed behind, already issuing instructions. Put her on the bed. I'll fetch clean linens and my healing salves. Poor thing looks half dead. Xavier gently laid Clara on the bed. I'll stable the horse and be back to help. By the time he returned, Mrs. Finch had managed to rouse Clara enough to help her drink a cup of broth and change into a clean nightgown. She's got some cuts that need watching and she's weak from hunger and thirst, but she'll live, Mrs. Finch reported. Tough one this girl, Xavier nodded. Let me know if you need anything, I'll be downstairs. He retreated to his study, pouring himself a small glass of whiskey and sinking into his leather chair. Images of Clara's exhausted face haunted him. He'd seen the aftermath of Indian attacks before, not as common these days with the treaties, but still a threat in the territories. The fact that she'd survived it all was remarkable. Morning brought the sound of movement upstairs. Xavier had just returned from his early chores when Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in a simple blue dress that Mrs. Finch must have lent her. Her hair was combed and braided, and much of the dirt had been washed away, revealing fair skin and striking green eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Holcomb," she said, her voice stronger than the day before. "I wanted to thank you properly for saving my life." Xavier removed his hat. "No thanks needed, Miss O'Sullivan. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone would have," she replied softly, descending the stairs. "I was beginning to think no one would come." Mrs. Finch appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Breakfast is ready." Miss O'Sullivan needs to eat to get her strength back. Over a simple but hearty meal of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, Clara shared more of her story. She had been traveling to Oregon to take up a teaching position in a small settlement. "All my belongings were in the wagon," she said, staring down at her plate. "My books, my clothes, my mother's locket, everything." "Were you traveling alone?" Xavier asked. Clara shook her head. "I joined the Perkins family in St. Louis. They were kind enough to let me travel with them." "Mr. Perkins, his wife, their 2 young sons." Her voice broke. "I don't know if any of them survived." Xavier exchanged a glance with Mrs. Finch. The reports he'd heard suggested there had been no survivors of the attack. "When you're feeling stronger, we can ride into town," Xavier said. "Sheriff Thompson might have more information, and you can send a telegram to Oregon, let them know what happened." Clara nodded, but her expression revealed her uncertainty. "What will I do now? I have no money, no possessions." Mrs. Finch reached over to pat her hand. "First things first. You get well, the rest will sort itself out." After breakfast, Xavier showed Clara around the ranch. Though still weak, she insisted on getting some fresh air, and he could see how being confined indoors would feel after her ordeal on the open prairie. "It's beautiful," she said as they stood looking out over the pasture where his cattle grazed. "Peaceful." "It is that," Xavier agreed. "Took me 10 years of working other men's land before I could afford my own place, worth every callus and sunburn." Clara smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, lighting up her green eyes. "You must be very proud." "I am, though it gets lonely sometimes, just me and Mrs. Finch rattling around in that house." "No wife?" Clara asked, then immediately blushed. "Forgive me." "That's none of my business." Xavier chuckled. "No need to apologize. No wife. Came close once, but she decided ranch life wasn't for her. Moved back east to Philadelphia." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, with Xavier shortening his stride to accommodate Clara's slower pace. When she began to tire, he led her to a shaded bench beneath an old oak tree. "Tell me about your teaching," he said as they sat down. "You must be quite educated." Clara's expression brightened at the topic. "I attended the normal school in Harrisburg. I've always loved learning, and I want to share that with children. Out here, education is so important but so hard to come by. Rivercross has been trying to establish a proper school," Xavier said thoughtfully. Right now, the minister's wife teaches the children in the church 3 days a week, but she's expecting a baby soon. Clara looked at him with sudden interest. Do you think they might need a teacher? It's possible. We can ask when we go into town. Hope flickered across Clara's face, then dimmed just as quickly. But I have no references with me, no credentials to show. Your word is good enough for me, Xavier said firmly, and I expect it will be good enough for the town council. 3 days later, when Clara had regained enough strength, Xavier helped her onto his wagon for the short journey into Rivercross. Mrs. Finch had altered one of her dresses to fit Clara's smaller frame, and though the dark green calico was plain, it suited her coloring perfectly. The town was quiet on a Tuesday morning, with just a few people going about their business on the dusty main street. Xavier tethered the horses outside the general store. "Sheriff's office is just down there," he said, pointing, "and the telegraph office is next door to it." "Where would you like to go first?" "The sheriff," Clara decided. "I need to know if there's any news of the Perkins family." Sheriff Thompson was a burly man with a thick mustache and kind eyes that belied his intimidating appearance. He removed his hat when Xavier introduced Clara. "Miss O'Sullivan, I'm mighty relieved to see you alive," he said. "We got word from Fort Kearney about the attack. Army patrol found the wagons 2 days after. They didn't report any survivors." Clara paled but remained composed. "Did they? Were there bodies?" The sheriff nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. They were given proper burial at the fort. I'm sorry for your loss." Clara swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes but not falling. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff. At least I know now." As they left the sheriff's office, Xavier placed a gentle hand on Clara's back, guiding her to a bench outside. "Take a minute," he said softly. "No rush." Clara nodded, staring straight ahead as she processed the confirmation of what she had feared. "I knew, really," she whispered. "Deep down, I knew they were gone, but hearing it." Xavier sat beside her, not speaking, simply offering his presence as comfort. After a few minutes, Clara straightened her shoulders and wiped her eyes. "I'd like to send that telegram now," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "And then, if you're still willing, I'd like to inquire about the teaching position." Xavier nodded, admiring her resilience. "Of course." The telegraph operator, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, helped Clara compose a message to the school board in Oregon, explaining what had happened and asking for guidance. She used the last of the money she had sewn into the hem of her dress to pay for it. "It may be a few days before you get a reply," the operator warned. "Lines have been down near Cheyenne." "I understand," Clara said. "Thank you." Their next stop was the church, a small white building with a modest steeple. The Reverend Mitchell and his wife were both there, the latter visibly pregnant and looking exhausted as she tried to corral a dozen children of various ages. When Xavier explained Clara's situation and her qualifications, Mrs. Mitchell's face lit up with undisguised relief. "Oh, thank the Lord," she exclaimed. "I've been praying for help. The baby is due in just 6 weeks, and I simply can't manage much longer." Reverend Mitchell was more cautious. "The town can't offer much in the way of salary, Miss O'Sullivan, and we have no proper schoolhouse yet." "I don't need much," Clara assured him. "Just room and board and perhaps a small stipend for personal necessities." The minister looked thoughtful. "We do have the old Abbott cabin on the edge of town. It's small, but it would give you a place of your own. As for board, well, the families take turns providing meals for the teacher." "That sounds more than fair," Clara said, her eyes bright with purpose now. "We'd need the town council's approval, of course," the Reverend added. "They meet tomorrow evening." Xavier spoke up. "Miss O'Sullivan can stay at my ranch until everything's settled. Mrs. Finch enjoys having another woman around." Clara gave him a grateful glance. "You've already done so much." "It's no trouble," Xavier insisted. "Besides, Mrs. Finch would have my hide if I suggested otherwise." The week that followed brought 2 significant developments. First, the town council unanimously approved Clara's appointment as the new teacher, impressed by her education and composure. Second, A telegram arrived from Oregon expressing condolences, but informing Clara that the position had been filled when she failed to arrive as scheduled. "It's for the best," Clara told Xavier as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I think I'm meant to be here in Rivercross." Xavier studied her profile, admiring the quiet determination that had replaced the despair of just days ago. "The children will be lucky to have you as their teacher." Clara turned to him with a smile. "I'm the lucky one. A week ago I thought my life was over. Now I have a purpose again, and it's all because of you. You give me too much credit. You're the one who survived against all odds." "Perhaps," Clara conceded, "but you were the one who found me." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Xavier cleared his throat and looked away first, suddenly aware of how easy it would be to lose himself in those green eyes. The Abbott cabin, as it turned out, needed significant repairs before it would be habitable. Xavier volunteered to help, and soon several other men from town joined in the effort. Clara watched with growing admiration as Xavier replaced rotted floorboards, fixed the leaking roof, and built new shutters for the windows. "You didn't have to do all this," she told him one afternoon as they took a break from work, sharing a jug of lemonade Mrs. Finch had sent along. Xavier wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm. "I wanted to. Besides, I couldn't let the town's new teacher live in a place with a hole in the roof, could I?" Clara laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent days. "I suppose not. Still, I wish there was some way I could repay your kindness." Xavier's expression grew serious. "Seeing you smile again is payment enough." Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not entirely due to the summer heat. Over the past 2 weeks, she had grown increasingly aware of Xavier, his quiet strength, his gentle manner with his horses, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was dangerous territory for a woman in her position, dependent as she was on the goodwill of others. That evening at dinner, Mrs. Finch announced that she would be visiting her sister in Kansas City for 2 weeks. "I haven't seen Harriet in 3 years," she explained. "And now that Miss O'Sullivan is here to keep an eye on things, I can go with an easy mind." Clara nearly choked on her water. "Mrs. Finch, I'll be moving to the cabin in just a few days." The housekeeper waved a dismissive hand. "The repairs won't be finished by then." "No, you'll stay here until the cabin is properly ready. Xavier would be lost without someone to remind him to come in for meals anyway." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "I managed just fine before you came along, Mrs. Finch. Eating cold beans from a can is not managing fine, young man." Clara couldn't help laughing at their banter, though the prospect of being alone in the house with Xavier sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach. Mrs. Finch departed 2 days later on the morning stage, leaving behind enough prepared food to feed an army and a list of instructions for both Clara and Xavier. "She thinks I'm 12 years old," Xavier muttered as they waved goodbye to the departing coach. "She cares about you," Clara replied. "You're fortunate to have someone who does." Xavier glanced at her, hearing the wistfulness in her voice. "You miss your family?" "Every day," Clara admitted. "My father died 2 years ago. My mother and younger sister are still in Pennsylvania, struggling to keep the farm going. That's why I took the teaching position to send money home." "You can still do that," Xavier pointed out as they walked back toward the house. "And now you're closer. Pennsylvania isn't as far as Oregon." Clara nodded, grateful for his optimism. "True, though I don't know when I'll be able to visit. The salary is modest." "The stage goes east twice a month," Xavier said. "When you're ready, perhaps I can help with the fare." Clara stopped walking and turned to face him. "Xavier, why are you doing all this for me? You barely know me." Xavier looked uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you're brave and resilient. I know you care about education and children. I know you've faced tragedy without letting it break you." He paused. "Isn't that enough to want to help someone?" Clara studied his face, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "Yes, I suppose it is," she replied softly. The next few days established a new routine. Xavier went about his ranch work during the day while Clara prepared for her teaching duties, reviewing the books available at the church and planning lessons. In the evenings, they would share dinner and then sit on the porch, talking until the stars came out. Clara learned that Xavier had come west at 15 after his parents died of influenza, working as a ranch hand and saving every penny. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of literature, and her dreams for the future. One evening, as a summer storm rolled in across the prairie, they were forced inside. Xavier built a fire against the unexpected chill, and Clara found herself sitting closer to him than usual on the sofa in the parlor. "Would you read something?" Xavier asked, gesturing to the bookshelf. "I don't get much time for reading, but I enjoy listening." Clara selected a volume of Tennyson's poetry and began to read, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verses. Outside, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled, but inside the warm parlor, a different kind of electricity was building. When she finished reading The Lady of Shalott, Clara looked up to find Xavier watching her intently, his blue eyes dark in the firelight. "You have a beautiful voice," he said quietly. "Thank you," she whispered, suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, of the crackle of the fire, of the storm raging outside mirroring the tumult in her heart. Xavier reached out slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Clara," he began, his voice husky. A tremendous crash of thunder made them both jump, breaking the moment. Clara stood quickly, nearly dropping the book. "It's getting late," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "I should retire." Xavier stood as well, looking as flustered as she felt. "Of course. Good night, Clara." "Good night, Xavier." Clara hurried up the stairs to her room, her heart pounding. What was she doing? She had known this man barely 3 weeks. She was dependent on his charity, about to start a new position in a new town. The last thing she needed was to complicate matters by developing feelings for him. And yet, as she lay in bed listening to the storm, she couldn't deny that those feelings had already taken root. The next morning brought clear skies and an unspoken agreement to pretend that the charged moment by the fire had never happened. Xavier was already out doing chores when Clara came down for breakfast, and when he returned mid-morning, his manner was cordial but reserved. "I need to ride out to check the north pasture fence," he said after a quick cup of coffee. "There's likely some damage after that storm. I might not be back until late afternoon." "I'll be fine," Clara assured him. "I want to finish planning my first week of lessons anyway." Xavier nodded and left, and Clara tried to ignore the hollow feeling his absence created. She threw herself into her work, spreading books and papers across the dining table, but her concentration was poor. Every creak of the house made her look up, hoping to see Xavier. By late afternoon, Clara was restless. She decided to walk out to the garden to pick vegetables for dinner, hoping the activity would clear her mind. The garden was Mrs. Finch's pride, neat rows of tomatoes, beans, carrots, and herbs flourishing under her care. Clara was kneeling to pull some carrots when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Xavier returning, but something was wrong. He was slumped forward in the saddle, one hand clutching his side. Clara dropped her basket and ran toward him. "Xavier, what happened?" He managed to dismount, grimacing in pain. "Found some rustlers cutting the fence. There was a fight. One of them had a knife." Clara's eyes widened at the blood staining his shirt. "Come inside, now." She helped him into the house and onto the sofa, then quickly gathered clean cloths, water, and the medical supplies Mrs. Finch kept in the kitchen. "Take off your shirt," she instructed, her teacher's voice firm and brooking no argument. Xavier complied with difficulty, revealing a nasty gash about 4 inches long on his left side. It was still bleeding, but not as heavily as Clara had feared. "Did you get the bastards?" she asked as she began cleaning the wound. Xavier looked surprised at her language, then chuckled despite his pain. "Yes, madam, tied them up and left them for the sheriff. Thompson should have them in custody by now," Clara nodded approvingly. Good, now hold still. This will hurt. She worked methodically, washing the wound, applying a poultice of herbs Mrs. Finch had prepared for emergencies, and then binding it with clean bandages. Her hands were steady, though her heart raced at the intimacy of tending to him this way, at the feel of his skin beneath her fingers. "Where did you learn to do this?" Xavier asked, watching her work. "My mother was the midwife in our town," Clara explained. "I often assisted her. She taught me a great deal about healing." When she finished, Xavier caught her hand. "Thank you, Clara." She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. The expression in his eyes made her breath catch. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. It was a brief kiss, tentative and sweet, but when she pulled back, Xavier's eyes had darkened. He reached up to cup her face, drawing her back to him for a deeper kiss that made her head spin and her heart race. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Clara pressed her forehead against his. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "You're injured and if you say you're in my debt one more time, Clara O'Sullivan, I might lose my mind," Xavier interrupted. "What's between us has nothing to do with gratitude or obligation, at least not on my side." Clara sat back, studying his face. "Not on mine either," she admitted. "But it's all happened so fast. 3 weeks ago I was dying alone in a field, now I'm—" She gestured helplessly. "Now you're what?" Xavier prompted gently. "Now I'm falling in love with you," she said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. "And it terrifies me." Xavier's expression softened. "Why does it terrify you?" Clara stood up, needing some distance to organize her thoughts. "Because I've lost everyone I've ever cared about, Xavier. My father to illness, the Perkins family to violence, my mother and sister to distance. I don't know if I can bear to lose anyone else." Xavier struggled to his feet, wincing at the movement. "Clara, look at me." Reluctantly, she turned to face him. "I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen," he said seriously. "This is still frontier country, life is unpredictable. But I can promise you this: I will never willingly leave you, not ever." Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. "How can you be so sure? You barely know me." "I know everything I need to know," Xavier insisted, taking a careful step toward her. "I know that finding you in that field was the best thing that ever happened to me. I know that the thought of you moving into that cabin in town makes my chest ache. I know that I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Clara's tears spilled over. "It's too soon," she protested weakly. "Is it?" Xavier challenged. "Out here, people don't always have the luxury of long courtships. Life is shorter, harder. When you find something real, you hold on to it with both hands." He took another step closer, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll never mention it again." Clara looked up at him, at the sincerity in his blue eyes, and knew she couldn't lie. "I feel it," she whispered. "I've felt it since that first day when you found me." Xavier smiled, a brilliant smile that transformed his entire face. "Then the timing doesn't matter, does it?" He bent to kiss her again, more urgently this time, and Clara responded in kind, all her doubts melting away in the heat of his embrace. When they broke apart, both were breathless. "You should rest," Clara said, suddenly remembering his injury. "You've lost blood and the wound could reopen." Xavier laughed softly. "Ever practical, Miss O'Sullivan," but he allowed her to help him back to the sofa. "What about my teaching position?" Clara asked as she sat beside him, her head resting on his uninjured shoulder. "You can still teach," Xavier assured her. "The ranch is only a mile from town. You could ride in each day." Clara considered this. "And the town council, what will they think?" "They'll think their teacher has made a very sensible match with a respectable landowner," Xavier said confidently. "Besides, half the council was helping repair your cabin. They've seen how we look at each other." Clara blushed. "Was it that obvious?" "Apparently to everyone except us," Xavier said wryly. The following week brought more changes. Clara's cabin was completed, but she never moved into it. Instead, Reverend Mitchell performed a simple ceremony in the ranch house parlor, with Mrs. Finch, returned early from her trip upon receiving Xavier's telegram, and half the town in attendance. Clara wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Xavier had ordered from Denver, and a locket containing a miniature portrait of her parents that Mrs. Finch had managed to commission from a traveling artist using Clara's descriptions. "Something new, something meaningful," the older woman had said gruffly as she fastened it around Clara's neck. "Every bride needs that." As Clara spoke her vows, looking up into Xavier's loving face, she marveled at how life could change so completely in just 1 month. From despair to joy, from loneliness to belonging, from certain death to a new beginning. She began teaching the following Monday, riding to town on a gentle mare that was Xavier's wedding gift to her. The children adored their new teacher, and the parents appreciated her dedication and knowledge. Each evening, she would return to the ranch, where Xavier waited for her on the porch, ready to help her down from her horse and hear about her day. Their nights were filled with passion and tenderness as they explored this new dimension of their relationship, learning each other's bodies as thoroughly as they had learned each other's hearts. One evening in late September, as they sat watching the sunset, Xavier placed his hand gently over Clara's stomach. "How much longer before we can tell everyone?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Clara covered his hand with hers, smiling at the tiny secret they shared. "Another month, I think, to be sure." The baby, conceived during their first week of marriage, was unexpected but welcomed with joy. Clara would teach until spring, then take a break while Mrs. Mitchell filled in temporarily. "A teacher and a rancher," Xavier mused, pulling Clara closer against the evening chill. "Not a bad combination for raising a child. Not bad at all," Clara agreed, turning to kiss him softly. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast Nebraska sky, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the tragedy, the desperation, the field where she had been certain she would die. And the cowboy who had found her, lifted her into his saddle, and carried her toward a future brighter than any she could have imagined. Here, in the circle of his arms, Clara had found not just safety but love, not just survival but life in all its fullness. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.